Good afternoon everybody, I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose and riddles stream. Now, the last poem we read last week was Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, and that was written by Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray was this individual. 1716 to 1771, an English poet, letter writer, classical scholar and professor at Pembroke College, Cambridge. He is widely known for his elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, published in 1751. As usual, we will begin this stream by rereading the last poem that we finished off on last week, and then we will move on to further poems, new poems, poems we haven't looked at yet. So, with that said, let's get started. So, this is an elegy written in a country churchyard. The curfew tolls the knell of a parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. Sorry, I'm not doing a very good job. Let me start again. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower, the moping owl does to the moon complain, of such as, wandering near her secret bower, molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms, that yew trees shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The breezy call of incense breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion, or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envy to kiss to share. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ever gave, await alike the inevitable hour, the path of glory lead but to the grave. Nor you, ye proud, impute to these the fault, if memory over their tomb no trophies raise, where through the long-drawn aisle and fretted vault the pealing anthem swells the note of praise. Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion called the fleeting breath? Can honour's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death? Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or wake to ecstasy the living lyre. But knowledge to their eyes her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did never unroll. Chill penury repressed the noble rage, and froze the genial current of the soul. Full many a gem of purest ray serene the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Some village Hampden, that with dauntless breast the little tyrant of his fields withstood, some muting glorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. The applause of listening senates to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty over a smiling land, and read their history in a nation's eyes. Their lot forbade, nor circumscribed alone, their growing virtues, but their crimes confined, forbade to wade through slaughter to a throne, and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. The struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide, to quench the blushes of ingenious shame, or the heap the shrine of luxury and pride, with incense kindled at the muse's flame. Ingenuous. Far from the maddening crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray along the cool sequestered vale of life. They kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Yet even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh, with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculptured deck, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. Their name, their years spelt by the unlettered muse, place of fame and elegy supply, and many a holy text around she strews, that teach the rustic moralist to die. For who to dumb forgetfulness a prey, the pleasing anxious being ever resigned, left the warm precincts of the cheerful day, nor cast one lingering look behind. On some fond breast the parting souls rely, some pious drops the closing eye requires. Even from the tomb the voice of nature cries, even in our ashes live the wonted fires. For thee who, mindful of the unhonoured dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate, if chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate. Haply some hoary-headed swain may say, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing the hasty steps the dews away, to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. There at the foot of yonder nodding beech, that reefs its old fantastic roots so high, his listless length at noontide would he stretch, and pour upon the brook that babbles by. Hard by yon wood now smiling, as in scorn, muttering his wayward fancies he would rove, how drooping woeful wan like one forlorn, or crazed with care, or crossed in hopeless love. One morn I missed him on the accustomed hill, along the heath and near his favourite tree. Another came, nor yet beside the rill, nor up the lawn, nor at the wood was he. The next with dirges due in sad array, slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. Approach and read, for thou canst read the lay graved on the stone beneath you, aged thorn. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. Fair science frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy marked him for her own. Large was his bounty, and his soul sincere, heavy did a recompense as largely send. He gave to misery all he had a tear. He gained from heaven, 'twas all he wished, a friend. No farther seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. My apologies, I don't think I read that poem particularly well. But it's quite a long one, so I don't think I should go back and read it all again. But that was Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, which seems to be something of a meditation on the nature of fame, fortune, life and death. So, moving on. Next we have the poem To RTHB by William Ernest Henley. William Ernest Henley was an English poet, writer, critic and editor. Though he wrote several books of poetry, Henley is remembered most often for his 1975 poem Invictus. A fixture in London literary circles, the one-legged Henley might have been the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's character Long John Silver, while his young daughter Margaret Henley inspired J.M. Barrie's choice of the name Wendy for the heroine of his play Peter Pan. My apologies. So let's read a little bit about him first, so that we have an idea of who he was, what happened in his life, and so we can speculate about how that may or may not have influenced his poetry. Henley was born in Gloucestershire on the 23rd of August 1849 to Mother Mary Morgan, a descendant of poet and cricket Joseph Wharton, and Father William, a bookseller and stationer. William Ernest was the oldest of 6 children, 5 sons and a daughter. His father died in 1868, so around when Ernest was 19 then. Henley was a pupil at the Crypt School, Gloucestershire, between 1861 and 1867. A commission had recently attempted to revive the school by securing as headmaster the brilliant and academically distinguished Thomas Edward Brown. Though Brown's tenure was relatively brief, 1857 to 1863, he was a revelation to Henley, because the poet was a man of genius, the first I'd ever seen. After carrying on a lifelong friendship with his former headmaster, Henley penned an admiring obituary for Brown in the New Review, December 1897. He was singularly kind to me at a moment when I needed kindness even more than I needed encouragement. Nevertheless, Henley was disappointed in the school itself, considered an inferior sister to the cathedral school, and wrote about its shortcomings in a 1900 article in the Pall Mall magazine. Much later, in 1893, Henley also received an LL.D. degree from the University of St Andrews. However, 2 years after that, he failed to secure the position of Professor of English Literature at the University of Edinburgh. I don't think we've read any poetry by Thomas Edward Brown. It's possible we'll find him later in the anthology, or possibly not. We'll have to see. Health issues on Long John Silver. From the age of 12, Henley had tuberculosis of the bone that resulted in the amputation of his left leg below the knee in 1868-69. So I'm guessing they don't know exactly when it happened. Not that it happened over New Year's. So the surgery was in two different years. I assume that's not the case. And was that not around the time his father died? 1868. Yeah. So it would have been shortly after, I think. The early years of Henley's life were punctuated by periods of extreme pain due to the draining of his tuberculosis abscesses. However, Henley's younger brother Joseph recalled how after draining his joints, the young Henley would hop about the room, laughing loudly and playing with zest to pretend he was beyond the reach of pain. Ooh. According to Robert Louis Stevenson's letters, the idea of the character of Long John Silver was inspired by Stevenson's real-life friend Henley. In a letter to Henley after the publication of Treasure Island, Stevenson wrote, "I will now make a confession. It was the sight of your maimed strength and masterfulness that begot Long John Silver. The idea of the maimed man rolling and dreaded by the sound was entirely taken from you." Stevenson's stepson, Lloyd Osborne, described Henley as a great glowing, massive-shouldered fellow with a big red beard and a crutch. Jovial, astoundingly clever, and with a laugh that rolled like music. He had an unimaginable fire and vitality. He swept one off one's feet. Frequent illness often kept Henley from school, although the misfortune of his father's business may have also contributed. In 1867, Henley passed the Oxford Local Schools examination. Soon after passing the examination, Henley moved to London and attempted to establish himself as a journalist. His work over the next 8 years was interrupted by long stays in hospitals, because his right foot had also become diseased. Henley contested the diagnosis that a second amputation was the only means to save his life, seeking treatment from the pioneering late 19th century surgeon Joseph Lister at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. Commencing in August 1873, Henley spent 3 years in hospital, during which he was visited by the authors Leslie Stephen and Robert Louis Stevenson, and wrote and published the poems collected as In Hospital. This also marked the beginning of a 15-year friendship with Stevenson. Interesting they say 15-year friendship, because we know that Ernest Henley lived much longer than that. Okay. Robert Louis Stevenson died in 1894. Okay. So yeah, this friendship presumably ended because Stevenson passed on, not for any other reason. I could go on reading, but I don't like to read an entire Wikipedia page during these streams. I think we probably know enough about him now. Enough for the purpose of informing our interpretation of his poetry. So, the first poem is called To RTHB. Going into this, I have no idea what RTHB may stand for. Whether that's a person, an institution, something else entirely, I'm not sure. Now, you must forgive me if I occasionally go quiet for a while. I've got a cold. So in all likelihood, I've just muted the mic briefly. Anyway. To RTHB. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the full clutch of circumstance, I've not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this path of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. Well, initially I interpret that to be directly related to the misfortune and pain he faced in life, and it representing a Oh, I'm very sorry, I wasn't quick enough with the muting there. Immediately I relate that to the pain and misfortune he faced in life, and a representation of his unconquerable spirit, his desire to press on no matter the hardship. But we will continue to look and analyse. One thing that's immediately obvious is the rhyming scheme. Clearly this is an AB rhyming scheme. So as far as rhythm is concerned, let's first see if each line has a consistent number of syllables. Looks like 8 syllables per line. If it does have a brain's gone blank. What's the word? If it does have a meter, then I suspect it's going to be iambic tetrameter. But the first line makes that very unlikely, because it would have to be out of the night that covers me, which doesn't work. So no, I don't think this has a meter. I could be wrong, I'm not an expert on these matters, but it doesn't look like that to me. But it does seem to have a consistent number of syllables, and it does seem to have It does seem to have a consistent number of syllables per line, and it does seem to have a rhyming structure. I don't think there were any words there that I didn't recognise. Oh, actually, that spelling of straight. That's clearly... See, I thought that spelling of straight referred to straits in the landscape sense. Yes, like that. A narrow pass, particularly on water. But okay, it looks like a strait actually originally referred to something narrow or restricted. Or righteous or strict. I can see, oh, it's in straight and narrow. Ah! That is very interesting. I'd always thought straight and narrow was the other straight, and it referred to not deviating from the proper path. But no, it's the other straight. I suppose the two senses are connected, aren't they? I mean, they're spelt differently, and the meanings are a little different, but I can see how... they both could have come, they could have a shared etymology. In fact, it's even an obsolete spelling of straight. Okay. That's very interesting. So no matter how straight the gate, I suppose that means no matter how hard it is to fit through, how charged with punishments the scroll, I don't follow. I feel like that is making an allusion to something that I just don't recognise. I don't suppose by any chance Wikipedia has a page on this. I'm guessing it won't. Doesn't look like it. I don't usually look the poems up on Wikipedia, but if there had been an explanation of that line, that would have been nice. I suppose it could be a reference to having one sentence read, because traditionally that might come from a scroll or an edict from, like, an emperor. That would be written on a scroll. But even if that is what he's alluding to, I don't follow the significance. Aside from it just being unpleasant. Okay. So yeah, if there's any other words that people are unsure about and they wanted to have looked up or just discuss, please put it in chat. If you have any questions in general about this poem, please put it in chat. But I think we've gleaned about as much out of this as I'm likely to be able to glean. So with that in mind, I will move on to the final reading. Then I'll check in chat to see if anyone's said anything, and if not, we will move on. So, I'll tell you what though, I am tempted to look up this poem just on the internet as well, Because at the very least, it would be nice to know what that stands for. Anyway. I shall read it once more. Just a second. Sorry about that. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am captain of my soul. Okay, this is a Wikipedia page for Invictus, which I believe was another poem by William Ernest Henley. And it says here, the second edition of Henley's Book of Verses added a dedication to RTHB, a reference to Robert Thomas Hamilton Bruce, a successful Scottish flour merchant, baker and literary patron. The 1900 edition of Henley's poems, published after Bruce's death, ordered the dedication to I.M. R.T. Hamilton Bruce, 1846 to 1899, whereby I.M. stands for in memoriam. Well, that certainly tells us what the I.M. means in this coming poem. So I can only assume that the 2RTHB is the title of a poem that was to him. Nope. It appears to be. It appears that the poem we just read is Invictus. So therefore, I would conclude that whomever put together this anthology made a mistake and assumed that 2RTHB was the title as opposed to my apologies. I can only assume that whoever put this anthology together made a mistake and mistook the dedication for the title of the poem. This poem itself appears to be Invictus. So, moving on. I am... ooh... I don't recognise that character. That looks like an OE ligature, not an AE ligature. But I've never heard of an OE ligature, and I have no idea how that would be pronounced. I wonder if that is in fact just a fancy AE ligature. Would that be I am the in memoriam? Was it in memoriam? In memoriam. So would that be in memoriam Margarete Sorori? Hold on. I don't know what language that's from, which doesn't help. Yeah, what language would have, even if I'm correct and that is an AE ligature, not an OE ligature, what language would have that? I think of that as being more of an Anglo-Saxon thing. I wasn't aware of it being used in the Romance languages, though perhaps it is. Well, I was just thinking, the R's are probably rolled, but they wouldn't be if it was English. So, I can't roll my R's, especially not with a cold, I'm sorry. Okay, so, in memoriam Margarete Sorori, I guess. That's probably butchered. But I think that's the best I can do with a cold, and I will stop rambling about this and get on with the poem itself. So, first reading. A late lark twitters from the quiet skies, and from the west, where the sun, his day's work ended, lingers as in content. There falls on the old grey city an influence luminous and serene, a shining peace. The smoke ascends in a rosy and golden haze. The spires shine and are changed. In the valley shadows rise. The lark sings on. The sun, closing his benediction, sinks, and the darkening air thrills with a sense of the triumphing night. Night with her train of stars, and her great gift of sleep. So be my passing, my task accomplished, and the long day done, my wages taken, and in my heart some late lark singing. Let me be gathered to the quiet west, the sundown splendid and serene, death. So a bit to unpack there. So, words. I'm gonna look up benediction. Oops, wrong website. I want Wiktionary. There we go. A short invocation for help, blessing, and guidance from God, said on behalf of another person or persons, sometimes at the end of a church worship service. In the Anglican Church, the ceremony used to institute an abbot, analogous to the consecration of a bishop. A Roman Catholic rite by which bells, banners, candles, etc. are blessed with holy water and formally dedicated to God. Help, good fortune, or reward from God or another supernatural source. From Middle English, benediction, from Ecclesiastical Latin benedictio, benedictionis, from benedictus, blessed, well spoken of. Benediction. So I'm guessing where it says the sun closing his benediction is probably the fourth sense of the word, help, good fortune, or reward from God or another supernatural source. The only other one that would make sense is an invocation for help, blessing, and guidance from God. My apologies, I wasn't fast enough yet again. Yeah, so the first sense of the word could make sense, but it doesn't in the context in which we find it. There's nothing else there that would suggest that this is the sun invoking anything, so therefore I conclude it is the good fortune and reward given by the sun. Although it does invoke a ecclesiastical tone. So, any other words? Lark, that's what I was going to look up. I had thought the lark was a bird of the morning, of the sunrise, but I want to double check that. The lark in mythology and literature stands for daybreak, as in Chaucer's The Knight's Tale. The busy lark, messenger of day, in Shakespeare's Sonnet 29. The lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. The lark is also often simultaneously associated with lovers and lovers. Of lovers and lovers' observance, as in Bernard de Vantadorn's Canve la Luzetta Mauvais. I know I'm butchering that, I apologise. And with church services, and often those the meanings of daybreak and religious reference are combined. In Blake's Visions of the Daughters of Albion, into a spiritual daybreak to signify passage from earth to heaven and from heaven to earth. In Renaissance painters such as Domenico Ghirlandaio, which I'm also butchering, the lark symbolises Christ in reference to John 16:16. Huh. Okay then. I'm not familiar with William Blake. I wonder if he will appear later in this anthology or not. Still. So yes, the lark is associated with both sunrise, but also apparently it has an ecclesiastical significance. And since this is a poem in memoriam, it would appear, it makes sense that this would have an ecclesiastical tone to it. So, I believe that is all the words that I wanted to look up. If anyone in chat would like a word either looked up or discussed, let me know. Write it in chat and I will do so shortly. So, rhyming. I don't think there is any. I don't see any. I will give it another read and see if I notice any. A late lark twitters from the quiet skies, and from the west, where the sun, his day's work ended, lingers as in content. There falls on the old grey city an influence luminous and serene, a shining peace. The smoke ascends in a rosy and golden haze. The spires shine and are changed. In the valley shadows rise. The lark sings on. The sun, closing his benediction, sinks in the darkening air. Thrills of a sense of the triumphing night. Night with a train of stars, and her great gift of sleep. So be my passing, My task accomplished, and the long day done. My wages taken, and in my heart some late lark singing. Let me be gathered to the quiet west, the sundown splendid and serene, death. I didn't notice any rhyming there. It does make me wonder if the late lark singing, since larks are associated with sunrise and not sunset, might in fact be a reference to the moving from Earth to heaven, as that Wikipedia page suggested. It could be. Right, is there a rhythmic structure? I really can't see one. No, I can't see any rhyming structure or rhythmic structure to this poem. I suppose aside from the fact that it tends to be short, snappy lines, which will give a certain sound to the poem. Aside from that, I'm not seeing any of either. Still, it's nice. So I guess I'll move on to the final reading. Again, if there's anything else about this poem that we haven't discussed that you'd like to discuss, please leave a message in chat, and I will now move on to the final reading. A late lark twitters from the quiet skies, and from the west, where the sun, his day's work ended, lingers as in content. There falls on the old grey city an influence luminous and serene, a shining peace. The smoke ascends, in a rosy and golden haze the spires shine and are changed. In the valley shadows rise, the lark sings on, the sun, closing his benediction, sinks, and the darkening air thrills with a sense of the triumphing night. Night with a train of stars, and her great gift of sleep, simply my passing. My task accomplished and the long day done, my wages taken, and in my heart some late lark singing. Let me be gathered to the quiet west, the sundown splendid and serene, death. So it sounds to me like this is a poem about passing on peacefully after an accomplished life, after all that had to be done was done. In that way, it does come across as both peaceful and serene. Again, a recurring theme, death, in the poetry that we've been looking at. Invictus, with themes of perseverance, was surprisingly enough a more uncommon theme for a poem in this anthology. But still, that was the poetry we have from William Ernest Henley in this anthology. Next we will be moving on to a poem by George Herbert entitled Virtue. George Herbert 1593 to 1633. So I'm pretty sure that would have been during the very tail end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, wouldn't it? Yeah, I think that's right. I'll double check that in a minute, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And I suppose, but by 1633 that would have been King James the First, if I remember correctly. King James the First. So I'll double check that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. His life spans Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. George Herbert was a Welsh poet, orator, and priest of the Church of England. His poetry is associated with the writings of the metaphysical poets, and he is recognised as one of the foremost British devotional lyricists. He was born into an artistic and wealthy family and largely raised in England. He received a good education that led to his admission to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1609. He went there with the intention of becoming a priest, but he became the university's public orator and attracted the attention of King James I. He served in the Parliament of England in 1624 and briefly in 1625. After the death of King James... Oh! Okay. So this would have been into King Charles I's reign. Herbert renewed his interest in ordination. He gave up his secular ambitions in his mid-30s and took holy orders in the Church of England, spending the rest of his life as the rector of the rural parish of Fuggleston, St. Peter, just outside Salisbury. He was noted for unfailing care for his parishioners, bringing the sacraments to them when they were ill, providing food and clothing for those in need. Henry Vaughan called him a most glorious saint and seer, who was never a wealthy man and died of consumption at age 39. So briefly, let's check the dates. I think he was born still during Queen Elizabeth I's reign, but let me double check that. Yep, she reigned up to 1603. Succeeded by James I, of course, where we get the King James Bible, and he only served up to 1625. I didn't realise how short his reign in England was. Of course, King James I was also King James VI of Scotland. That's where the union between England and Scotland came from. If you didn't know better, you might assume, oh, well, I suppose England must have conquered Scotland at some point or something like that. Nothing of the sort is true. The reason why England and Scotland became united was because their monarchies, well, as was the done thing in the day, of course there was a lot of intermarrying between royals of different nations, and it just so happened that both the English and Scottish monarchies fell onto King James. So the point I am getting to is the fact that although that is actually a surprisingly short reign, only about 22 years, that's only the portion when he reigned in England, presumably. Yes, he had a much, much longer reign when you include his reign in Scotland. Anyway, and then we have Charles I, who of course died of beheading, and of course that coming at the end of the English Civil War. He was captured and beheaded. well, I say came at the end of the English Civil War. He had been... The Civil War at that point, I understand, was over. And he was just under control of those in power, presumably under house arrest, and they decided to execute him. Anyway, all this is just to place George Herbert in context. So we've read about his life and we know a bit about the times in which he lived. Let us begin with the first reading of Virtue. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky, the dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue angry and brave bids the rash gazer wipe his eye, thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie, my music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber never like seasoned timber never gives, but though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. Interesting. I don't think there are any words there I need to look up. I am going to look up bridal. I obviously that refers to a bride, but I do wonder if it has some other sense. The bridal of the earth and the sky. Wait, it does, doesn't it? Doesn't it also... Isn't a bridal something that gets put over animals' faces? Or maybe I'm just confused. Oh! A wedding feast or festival, a wedding. Also offer pertaining to a bride to a wedding nuptial. Okay, there is such a thing as a bridle as goes over an animal's face. A horse with a bridle, but that's spelt differently. Okay, so that's not the sense in which this is. So I would suggest that a bridal in this sense refers to a wedding. Okay. We have an ABAB roaming scheme. This seems very popular. Now, what about any rhythmic structure? So it looks like it's aiming for a in each paragraph, or should I say, stanza. It looks like in each stanza it's aiming for a syllabic structure of 8884, which I don't remember encountering before. I'd be surprised if it doesn't have a name. I just don't know what that name is. It certainly has a very interesting sound to it. It almost sounds like it's coming to a definite conclusion with the way that the final verse in each stanza is much shorter. However, I do note that in not every case does this poem achieve 8 syllables where it attempts to. In some cases we have verses with 9 syllables, but we can still see what they were going for. In some lines it seems iambic. Like the first line I think was probably meant to be iambic. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright. That's got a real ba-dum, 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 ba-dum rhythm to it. But then there are other lines that just don't have that quality. Like the next line, the bridal of the earth and sky. That's not iambic. Not unless I'm very much mistaken. So I think what we can say is that clearly some attention has been paid to the rhythm of the poem, and that attention has been worthwhile. It has created an effect, but that the effect isn't complete. Only so much effort has been gone to, possibly because the poet had achieved what they set out to do and didn't feel they had to do any more. So that's what we're looking at in terms of rhyming and rhythmic structure. So let's look at each stanza one at a time and discuss what it means. The sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky, that you shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. So that seems to be just, unless I'm missing something, that seems to be just a rather literal description of things which take place on a nice day, but with fairly emotive language, painting a wonderful scene and then ending it with it must come to an end. Next, sweet rose whose hue, angry and brave, bids the rash gazer wipe his eye. Thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. I wonder why they describe them as a rash gazer. By angry and brave, I assume they're indicating that it's a red rose, hence associated with romance. I could be wrong. Yes, a rash obviously means acting too quickly without considering the consequences or risks. Not careful, hasty. Requiring swift action, taking effect quickly. An irregular distribution or sprinkling of objects. No, wouldn't be that. Chiefly preceded by a descriptive word. A fabric was smooth, texture woven from silk, worsted, or a mixture of the two, intended as an inferior substitute for silk. Cloth rash, silk rash. No. Soft crackling or rustling sound. No. Forcibly move or push, to break, to omit or issue. Usually followed by up to prepare. Nope. To move. Of rain to fall heavily. No. Chiefly followed by way down, off or out to pluck, pull or rip. No. Tack, slash or slice. Nope. Followed by out to scrape or scratch. No. Huh. I can't explain that. Bids a rash gazer wipe his eye. I mean, it just seems odd to refer to the gazer as rash. If they mean in the usual modern sense of acting too quickly without considering the consequences, it's an odd image to think of someone rashly gazing at something. Particularly if it's implied that the result of rashly gazing at a rose is to cause one to weep. I don't know. Or perhaps it has some other archaic sense that's just going over my head. But again, well, we have the interesting imagery of thy root is ever in its grave, so the point being that when the rose dies, it rots into the earth, and its roots were always in the earth. And again, we have the conclusion, and thou must die. So again, it all comes to an end. Next, sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie. My music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. I'm not sure what they mean by ye have your closes. Do they mean that you must come to a close, or is there something else being implied here? To finish, to terminate. It's looking that way, isn't it? That it just means to come to an end, which would be thematically on point. Oh, you can describe weather as close, apparently. Hot, humid, and with no wind. I doubt that's what it means, though, in this context. Nope, I don't have a better explanation. I assume it's just referring to the fact that that sweet spring also comes to an end. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives. But though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. It's the last bit that's throwing me. See, the penultimate two lines, well, the penultimate pair of lines, only a sweet and virtuous soul like seasoned timber never gives. That ties this whole poem together in terms of its title, virtue, and its ecclesiastical nature. It's like saying, or rather, it seems to be saying, all these wonderful, wonderful things in the world will eventually come to an end. The only thing that is truly permanent is a virtuous soul. And presumably, the reason to stress that the soul has to be virtuous is because they want people to behave virtuously, and because virtuous souls go to heaven and are with God. You could make the argument, but surely impious souls are also, or sinful souls are also immortal, they just go to hell, but I don't know. Perhaps there's something else going on here, going over my head. And certainly the last two lines, I just don't fully follow what they're getting at. But though the whole world turned to coal, then chiefly lives. Let's have a quick look. No, it doesn't have a Wikipedia page, so no help there. No, it's irritating. I don't follow those last two lines. Still, I'd best bring this part of the this section of the stream to a close. So, moving on to the final reading. Again, if anyone in chat wants to discuss anything in particular about this poem, just leave a message and I will look at it shortly. So, the final reading. Virtue, by George Herbert. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky, the dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose whose hue, angry and brave, bids the rash gazer wipe his eye, thy root is ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie, my music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but thou the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. So, that brings the poetry to a close for this week. Next we move on to Pride and Prejudice. So as usual, we'll recap what we read last week. I believe we read chapters 26, 27, 28 and 29 last week. So, in chapter 26, Mrs. Gardiner warns Elizabeth about becoming romantically entangled with Mr. Wickham and the dangers therein. Elizabeth agrees to visit Charlotte in Hunsford after the marriage, that is when after Charlotte has married Mr. Collins, and Elizabeth expects to be accompanied by Sir William Lucas and Miss Maria Lucas, who are Charlotte's father and sister respectively. Jane sees little of the Bingleys, and upon visiting them, and eventually being visited back by Caroline, that is Caroline Bingley, Caroline drops heavy hints at her lack of pleasure in the acquaintance, ultimately causing Jane to apparently abandon it. In a letter to Mrs. Gardner, Elizabeth reveals that Mr. Wickham has moved his attentions to another young lady, Miss King, who has recently come into £10,000. In chapter 27, Elizabeth and the two Lucases stop by the Gardners on their way to Hunsford. Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardner discuss recent events in more detail, so the things they had been discussing in their letters already, but they have a chance to discuss it in person in more detail. And then Elizabeth is invited on a tour of pleasure which is to take place in summer, which she happily accepts shortly before they leave. Then in chapter 28, the party reached the parsonage in Hunsford, in which Elizabeth finds the place much as she expected, Mr. Collins being his usual embarrassing self, and Charlotte tolerating it with the most good humour she can manage. We also see Mrs. Jenkinson and Mr. Burr arrive by carriage, and they invite the Collinses and their guests to dine at Rosings the next day. Rosings obviously being the house of Lady Catherine de Burr. In chapter 29, in spite of having been at St. James, which I should probably double check what that is, I assume that's a rather nice school. But it might be a palace. The area's name... St. James is the central district in the city of Westminster, London. The area's name is derived from the dedication of a 12th century leper hospital to St. James the Less. The hospital site is now occupied by St. James's Palace. St. James's Palace is the most senior royal palace in the United Kingdom. I probably should have heard of it then. As in, I'm ignorant. Not they're wrong, I'm ignorant. It gives its name to the Court of St. James, which is the monarch's royal court and is located in the city of Westminster, in London. Although no longer the principal residence of the monarch, it is the ceremonial meeting place of the Ascension Council, the office of the Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps, and that would be the... Should that be the diplomatic cause? I think it probably should. Let me check. Oh, that's German. What about English? Cause, I believe. Yeah, so Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps and the London residence of several minor members of the royal family. Okay. So we'll continue with my recap of what has happened recently in Pride and Prejudice. So we were discussing chapter 29, and I was saying, in spite of having been to St. James's, so I assume that's where Sir William went to, that is St. James's Palace, to be knighted. Sir William is awed by the grandeur he sees at Rosings. Lady Catherine shows herself to be very comfortable in her position of superiority, delivering her opinion on every subject in so decisive a manner as proof that she was not used to having her judgment controverted. Sorry, I don't seem to be reading very well today. These are notes that I made, incidentally. Elizabeth does not deign to give a direct answer to Lady Catherine concerning her age, which is notable, because it seems that Lady Catherine is used to being in a superior position. Although Elizabeth was very polite about the whole thing, even if she was indirect. So, that's where we're up to. Chapter 30. Oh, I probably should have said, at the very end of chapter 29, the group leaves. So they are no longer at Rosings. This is presumably the day later. Chapter 30. Sir William stayed only a week at Hunsford, but it is... My apologies, as I said previously, I have a cold. Sir William stayed only a week at Hunsford, but his visit was long enough to convince him of his daughter's being most comfortably settled, and of possessing such a husband and such a neighbour as were not often met with. While Sir William was with them, Mr. Collins devoted his mornings to driving him out in his gig. Okay, what do they mean by a gig? Is that a type of carriage? A gig could be a small, narrow, open boat carried in a larger ship and used for transportation between the ship and the shore. Another vessel, a similar rowing boat or sailboat, especially when used for racing. Specifically, a 6-oared sea rowing boat commonly found in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. Or a 2-wheeled carriage drawn by a single horse. That'll be it. So that. So, while Sir William was with them, Mr. Collins devoted his morning to driving him out in his gig and showing him the country, but when he went away the whole family returned to their usual employments, and Elizabeth was thankful to find that they did not see more of her cousin by the alteration, for the chief of the time between breakfast and dinner was now passed by him either at work in the garden or in reading and writing, and looking out of the window in his own book room, which fronted the road. The room in which the ladies sat was backwards. Elizabeth had at first rather wondered what Charlotte should not prefer the dining parlour for common use. It was a better-sized room and had a more pleasant aspect, but she soon saw that her friend had an excellent reason for what she did, for Mr. Collins would undoubtedly have been much less in his own apartment had they sat in one equally lively, and she gave Charlotte credit for the arrangement. From the drawing-room they could distinguish nothing in the lane, and were indebted to Mr. Collins for the knowledge of what carriages went along, and how often, especially Miss de Bourgh, drove by in her phaeton, which he never failed coming to inform them of, though it happened almost every day. She not unfrequently stopped at the parsonage, and had a few minutes' conversation with Charlotte, but was scarcely ever prevailed upon to get out. That would be get out of the carriage. Very few days passed in which Mr. Collins did not walk to Rosings, and not many in which his wife did not think it necessary to go likewise, until Elizabeth recollected that there might be other families living to be disposed of, she could not understand the sacrifice of so many hours. Now and then they were honoured with a call from her ladyship, and nothing escaped her observation that was passing in the room during these visits. She examined into their employments, looked at their work, and advised them to do it differently, found fault with the arrangement of the furniture, or detected the housemaid in negligence, and if she accepted any refreshment, seemed to do it only for the sake of finding out that Mrs. Collins' joints of meat were too large for her family. Elizabeth soon perceived that though the great lady was not in the commission of the peace of the county, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish. The minutest of concerns of which were carried to her by Mr. Collins, and whenever any of the cottagers were disposed to be quarrelsome, discontented, or too poor, she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints, and scold them into harmony and plenty. The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and allowing for the loss of Sir William, and there being only one card table in the evening, every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first. The other engagements were few, as the style of living in the neighbourhood in general was beyond Mr. Collins's reach. This, however, was no evil to Elizabeth, and upon the whole she spent her time comfortably enough. There were half hours of pleasant conversation with Charlotte, and the weather was so fine for the time of year that she had often great enjoyment out of doors. Her favourite walk, and where she frequently went when others were calling on Lady Catherine, was along the open grove which edged that side of the park, where there was a nice sheltered path, which no one seemed to value but herself, and where she felt beyond the reach of Lady Catherine's curiosity. In this quiet way, the first fortnight of her visit soon passed away. Easter was approaching, and the week preceding it was to bring an addition to the family at Rosings, which in so small a circle must be important. Elizabeth had heard soon after her arrival that Mr. Darcy was expected there in the course of a few weeks, and though there were not many of her acquaintances whom she did not prefer, his coming would furnish one comparatively new look at in that Rosing. My apologies. And though there were not many of her acquaintances whom she did not prefer, his coming would furnish one comparatively new look at in the Rosings parties, and she might be amused in seeing how hopeless Miss Bingley's designs on him were, by his behaviour to his cousin, for whom he was evidently destined by Lady Catherine, who talked of his coming with the greatest satisfaction, spoke of him in terms of the highest admiration, and seemed almost angry to find that he had already been frequently seen by Miss Lucas and herself. His arrival was soon known at the parsonage, for Mr. Collins was walking the whole morning within view of the lodges opening into Hunsford Lane, in order to have the earliest assurance of it, and after making his bow as the carriage turned into the park, hurried home with great intelligence. On the following morning he hastened to Rosings to pay his respects. There were two nephews of Lady Catherine to require them, for Mr. Darcy had brought with him a Colonel Fitzwilliam and the youngest son of his uncle, Lord and, to the great surprise of all the party, when Mr. Collins returned, the gentlemen accompanied him. Charlotte had seen them from her husband's room, crossing the road, and immediately running into the other, told the girls what an honour they might expect, adding, "I may thank you, Eliza, for this piece of civility. Mr. Darcy would never have come so soon to wait upon me." Elizabeth had scarcely time to disclaim all right to the compliment, before their approach was announced by the doorbell. Ooh, they had doorbells. I wonder if that is a literal bell. It must be, surely. Because obviously it's not a knocker, that's something completely different. Interesting. And shortly afterwards, the three gentlemen entered the room. Colonel Fitzwilliam, who led the way, was about 30, not handsome, but in person and address most truly the gentleman. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire, paid his compliments, with his usual reserve, to Mrs. Collins, and whatever might be his feelings towards her friend, met her with every appearance of composure. Elizabeth merely curtsied to him without saying a word. Colonel Fitzwilliam entered into the conversation directly with the readiness and ease of a well-bred man, and talked very pleasantly, but his cousin, after having addressed a slight observance of the house and garden to Mrs. Collins, sat for some time without speaking to anybody. At length, however, his civility was so far awakened as to inquire of Elizabeth after the health of her family. She answered him in the usual way, and after a moment's pause added, "My eldest sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her there?" She was perfectly sensible that he never had, but she wished to see whether he would betray any consciousness of what had passed between the Bingleys and Jane, and she thought he looked a little confused as he answered that he had never been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet. The subject was pursued no farther, and the gentleman soon afterwards went away. Chapter 31. Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners were very much admired at the parsonage, and the ladies all felt that he must add considerably to the pleasures of their engagements at Rosings. It was some days, however, before they received an invitation thither, for while there were visitors in the house they could not be necessary, and it was not till Easter Day, almost a week after the gentleman's arrival, that they were honoured by such an attention, and then they were merely asked on leaving church to come there in the evening. For the last week they had seen very little of Lady Catherine or her daughter. Colonel Fitzwilliam had called at the parsonage more than once during the time, but Mr. Darcy they had seen only at church. The invitation was accepted, of course, and at a proper hour they joined the party in Lady Catherine's drawing-room. Her ladyship received them civilly, but it was plain that their company was by no means so acceptable as when she could get nobody else, and she was, in fact, almost engrossed by her nephews, speaking to them, especially to Darcy, much more than to any other person in the room. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really glad to see them. Anything was a welcome relief to him at Rosings, and Mrs. Collins' pretty friend had moreover caught his fancy very much. He now seated himself by her, and talked so agreeably of Kent and Hertfordshire, of travelling and staying at home, of new books and music, that Elizabeth had never been half so well entertained in that room before, and they conversed with so much spirit and flow as to draw the attention of Lady Catherine herself, as well as of Mr. Darcy. His eyes had been soon repeatedly turned towards them with a look of curiosity, and that her ladyship after a while shared the feeling was more openly acknowledged, for she did not scruple to call out, "What is that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you are talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We are speaking of music, madam," said he, when no longer able to avoid a reply. "Oh, of music! Then pray speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I have ever learnt, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne if her health had allowed her to apply. I am confident that she would have performed delightfully. How does Georgina get on, Darcy?" Mr. Darcy spoke with affectionate praise of his sister's proficiency. "I am very glad to hear such an account of her," said Lady Catherine, "and pray tell her, from me, that she cannot expect to excel if she does not practise a good deal." "I assure you, madam," he replied, "that she does not need such advice. She practises very constantly." "So much the better. It cannot be done too much, and when I next write to her, I shall charge her not to neglect it on any account. I often tell young ladies that no excellence in music is to be acquired without constant practice. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practises more, and though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I have often told her, to come to Rosings every day, and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way, you know, in that part of the house." Mr. Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's ill-breeding, and made no answer. When coffee was over, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of having promised to play to him, and she sat down directly on to the instrument. He drew a chair near her. Lady Catherine listened to half a song and then talked, as before, to her other nephew, till the latter walked away from her, and making with his usual deliberation towards the pianoforte, stationed himself so as to command a full view of the fair performer's countenance. Elizabeth saw what he was doing, and at the first convenient pause turned to him with an arch smile and said, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me? I will not be alarmed, though your sister does play so well. There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises at every attempt to intimidate me." "I shall not say you are mistaken," he replied, "because you could not really believe me to entertain any design of alarming you, and I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which in fact are not your own." Elizabeth laughed heartily at this picture of herself, and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me, and teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so able to expose my real character, in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, is very ungenerous in you to mention all that you knew to my disadvantage in Hertfordshire, and give leave to say very impolitic too, for it is provoking me to retaliate, and such things may come out as will shock your relations to hear." "I am not afraid of you," said he, smilingly. "Pray let me hear what you have to accuse him of," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I should like to know how he behaves among strangers." "You shall hear then, but prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time of my ever seeing him in Hertfordshire, you must know, was at a ball, and at this ball what do you think he did? He danced only for 4 dancers, the gentlemen were scarce, and to my certain knowledge more than one young lady was sitting down in want of a partner. Mr. Darcy, you cannot deny the fact." "I had not at that time the honour of knowing any lady in the assembly beyond my own party." "True, and nobody can ever be introduced in a ballroom. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, what do I play next? My fingers wait your orders." "Perhaps," said Darcy, "I should have judged better had I sought an introduction, but I am ill qualified to recommend myself to strangers." "Shall we ask your cousin the reason of this?" said Elizabeth, still addressing Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Shall we ask him why a man of sense and education, who has lived in the world, is ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers?" "I can answer your question," said Fitzwilliam, "without applying to him. It is because he will not give himself the trouble." "I certainly have not the talent, which some people possess," said Darcy, "of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation, or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done." "My fingers," said Elizabeth, "do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women do. They have not the same force or rapidity, and do not produce the same expression, but then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I will not take the trouble of practising. It is not that I do not believe my fingers as capable as any other woman's of superior execution." Darcy smiled and said, "You are perfectly right. You have employed your time much better. No one admitted to the privilege of hearing you can think anything wanting. We neither of us perform to strangers." Here they were interrupted by Lady Catherine, who called out to know what they were talking of. Elizabeth immediately began playing again. Lady Catherine approached, and after listening for a few minutes, said to Darcy, "Miss Bennet would not play at all amiss if she practised more, and could have the advantage of a London master. She has a very good notion of fingering, though her taste is not equal to Anne's. Anne's would have been a delightful performer had her health allowed her to learn." Elizabeth looked at Darcy to see how coldly he assented to his cousin's praise, but neither at that moment nor at any other would she discern any symptom of love, and from the whole of his behaviour to Miss de Bourgh she derived this comfort from Miss Bingley, that he might have been just as likely to marry her had she been his relation. Lady Catherine continued her remarks on Elizabeth's performance, mixing with them many instructions on execution and taste, Elizabeth received them with all the forbearance of civility, and, at the request of the gentleman, remained at the instrument till her ladyship's carriage was ready to take them all home. Chapter 32. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door. Now I am curious, a ring at the door, not the doorbell. I suppose you'd say a bell's ringing. Okay. So I'm still working on the assumption this is a literal bell. So as I was saying, when she was startled by a ring at the door, the certain signal of a visitor. As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not unlikely to be... she thought it... As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not unlikely to be Lady Catherine, and under that apprehension was putting away her half-finished letter, that she might escape all impertinent questions, when the door opened, and, to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. He seemed astonished too on finding her alone, and apologised for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies were to be within. Sorry, I was having difficulty passing that. So, in case it wasn't clear to anyone else, Mr. Darcy was expecting to find all the ladies there, but he only found Elizabeth, I think. They then sat down, and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to think of something, and in this emergence, recollecting when she had seen him last in Hertfordshire, and feeling curious to know what he would say on the subject of their hasty departure, she observed, "How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for, if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you." She found she was to receive no other answer, and after a short pause added, "I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again. I have never heard of him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in the future. He has many friends, and is at a time of his life when friends and engagements are continually increasing. If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighbourhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a settled family there. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighbourhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep it or quit it on the same principle." "I should not be surprised," said Darcy, "if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers." Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and having nothing else to say, was now determined to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him. He took the hint, and soon began with, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford. I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object." Sorry, I'll say that again. "I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object. Mr. Collins appears to be very fortunate in his choice of a wife. Yes, indeed, his friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him, or have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light it is certainly a very good match for her. It must be very agreeable for her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends. An easy distance, do you call it? It's nearly 50 miles. And what is 50 miles of good road? Little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance. I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match, cried Elizabeth. I should never have said Mrs. Collins was settled near her family. It is proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far. As he spoke, there was a sort of smile which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane and Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered. I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. There is fortune to make the expenses of travelling unimportant. Distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys, and have persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance. Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding again. And I'm persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance. Oh, I see. That makes sense. So under less than means above. Because you're reducing something, you're making it less. So to not go the whole way, that is to underdo it, would mean that it would have to be greater. Okay. So the essential meaning, which is what I thought it meant to begin with, is that the distance would have to be at least half the present distance for her to call herself near her family. So 25 miles. At least. I was just having difficulty passing the exact grammar of that sentence. Grammar and meaning. Anyway, Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her and said, "You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn." Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" A short dialogue on the subject of the country ensued, on either side calm and concise, and was soon put an end to by the entrance of Charlotte and her sister, just returned from her walk. The tete-a-tete surprised them. Mr. Darcy related the mistake which had occasioned him intruding on Miss Bennet, and after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he would never have called on us in this familiar way." But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case, and after various conjectures they could at last only suppose his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of year. All field sports were over. Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot always be within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, or the pleasantness of the walk to it, or if the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. They called at various times of the morning, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and now and then accompanied by their aunt. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he had pleasure in their society, a persuasion which of course recommended him still more, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as by his evident admiration of her former favourite George Wickham, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as his evident admiration of her former favourite George Wickham. and though, in comparing them, she saw there was less captivating softness in Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners, she believed he might have the best informed mind. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage it was difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips. When he did speak, it seemed the effect of necessity rather than of choice, a sacrifice to propriety, not a pleasure to himself. He seldom appeared really animated. Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. Colonel Fitzwilliam, occasionally laughing at his stupidity, proved that he was generally different, which her own knowledge of him could not have told her, and as she would like to have believed, this changed the effect of love, and the object of that love, her friend Eliza. She set herself seriously to work to find it out. She set herself seriously to work to find it out. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings, and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success. He certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there was much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject, from the danger of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment, for in her opinion, it admitted not of doubt that all her friend's dislike would vanish if she could suppose him to be in her power. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam, who was beyond comparison the most pleasant man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had considerable patronage in the church, and his cousin could have none at all. Chapter 33. More than once did Elizabeth, in a rambling within the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. She felt all the perverseness of the mischance that should bring him where no one else was brought, and, to prevent its ever happening again, took care to inform him at first that it was a favourite haunt of hers. Now it could occur a second time, therefore, was very odd. Yet it did, and even a third. It seemed like a wilful ill nature, or a voluntary penance. For on these occasions it was not merely a few formal inquiries and an awkward pause and then away, but he actually thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much, but it struck her in the course of their third rencontre. I'm going to look that up. I assume that means something along the lines of to reconvene, as in to meet again. Encounter. A chance or unexpected meeting. But I don't see any pronunciation information for English, so I don't know how that should be pronounced, unfortunately. And the French pronunciation is beyond me. So I guess I will proceed by just butchering it. But it struck her in the course of their third rencontre that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins' happiness, and that in speaking of Rosings and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. I'm not sure what he means by not perfectly understanding the house. Understanding in what sense? Oh, I suppose because maybe it's suggesting he's going into so much detail about the house that it's as if he expects she needs to have that knowledge because she'll be staying there in the future. That's my best guess. His words seem to imply it. Could he have Colonel Fitzwilliam in his thoughts, she supposed? If he meant anything, he must mean an allusion to what might arise in that quarter. It distressed her a little, and she was quite glad to find herself at the gate in the pales opposite the parsonage. Pale could be a stake or a picket. A fence made from wooden stake. Oh, the bounds of morality, good behaviour or judgment in civilised company, as in beyond the pale. Ah! The limits or bounds. Okay, that makes sense. Sorry, I'm not sure if I showed that that page. So presumably when it describes at the gates in the pales opposite the parsonage, it means the gate in the fence. She was engaged one day as she walked in pursuing Jane's last letter and dwelling on some passages which proved that Jane had not written in spirits when, instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw on looking up that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Putting away the letter immediately and forcing a smile, she said, "I did not know before that you ever walked this way." "I have been making the tour of the park," he replied, "as I generally do every year, and I intend to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much farther?" "No, I should have turned in a moment." And accordingly she did turn, and they walked toward the parsonage together. "Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday?" said she. "Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again, but I am at his disposal. He arranges a business just as he pleases, and if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he is at least pleasure in the great power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy." "He likes to have his own way very well," replied Colonel Fitzwilliam. "But so do we all." "But so we all do. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich, and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured to self-denial and dependence. In my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you chose, or procuring anything you had fancy for? These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature, but in matters of greater weight I may suffer from want of money. Younger sons cannot marry where they like, unless where they like women of fortune, which I think they very often do. Our habits of expense make us too dependent, and there are not many in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some attention to money. Is this, thought Elizabeth, meant for me?" And she coloured at the idea, but recovering herself, said in a lively tone, "And pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son? Unless the elder brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above £50,000? He answered her in the same style, and the subject dropped. To interrupt a silence which might make him fancy her affected, with what had passed, she soon afterwards said, "I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having someone at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry to secure a lasting convenience of that kind, but perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her." "No," said Colonel Fitzwilliam, "that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy." "Are you indeed? And pray what sort of guardians do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage, and if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way." As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and in a manner which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness. Convinced her that he had somehow or other got pretty near the truth, she directly replied, "You need not be frightened. I never heard any harm of her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favourite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say you know them." "I know them a little. Their brother is a pleasant gentleman-like man. He is a great friend of Darcy's." "Oh, yes," said Elizabeth dryly. "Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes a prodigious deal of care of him." "Care of him?" "Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care, from something he told me in our journey hither. I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him, but I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person he meant. It was all conjecture." "What is it you mean?" "It is a circumstance which Darcy would not wish to be generally known, because if it were to get round to a lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing. You may depend upon my not mentioning it." "Oh, to the lady's family. So I wonder if that means Lady Catherine. And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconvenience of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars, and I only suspected it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer." "Did Mr. Darcy give you reasons for this interference? I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. And what arts did he use to separate them?" "I'm not sure what they mean by that. And what arts did he use to separate them?" "Oh, as in, what skills did he employ to keep the two apart?" "That makes sense." "He did not talk to me of his own art," said Fitzwilliam, smiling. "He only told me what I have now told you." Elizabeth made no answer and walked on, her heart swelling with indignation. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. "I am thinking of what you've been telling me," said she. "Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why was he to be the judge? You are rather disposed to call his interference officious." Officious. Obliging, attentive, eager to please, offensively intrusive or interfering in offering advice and services. Huh. Quite the difference in those definitions. "You're rather disposed to call his interference officious. I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide on the propriety of his friend's inclination, or why, upon his own judgment alone, he was determined and direct in what manner his friend was to be happy. But," she continued, recollecting herself, "as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case." "This is not an unnatural surmise," said Fitzwilliam, "but it is a lessening of the honour of my cousin's triumph very sadly." This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on indifferent matters until they reached the parsonage. There, shut into her own room, as soon as their visitors left, she could think without interruption of all that she had heard. It was not to be supposed that any other people could be meant than those with whom she was connected. There could not exist in the world two men over whom Mr. Darcy could have such boundless influence. That he had been concerned in the measures taken to separate Bingley and Jane, she had never doubted, but she had always attributed Miss Bingley the principal design and arrangement of them. If his own vanity, however, did not mislead him, he was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause. Of all that Jane had suffered, and still continued to suffer. He had ruined for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world, and no one could say how lasting an evil he might have inflicted. I need to double check the meaning of caprice. An impulsive, seemingly unmotivated action, change of mind or notion, whim. Brief romance, an unpredictable or sudden condition change or series of changes, a disposition to be impulsive. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and those strong objections probably were her having one uncle who was a country attorney, and another who was in business in London. To Jane herself, she exclaimed, there could be no possibility of objection, all loveliness and goodness as she is. Her understanding excellent, her mind improved, and her manners captivating. Neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, his abilities Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain, and respectability which he will probably never reach. When she thought of her mother, her confidence gave way a little, but she would not allow that any objection there had material weight with Mr. Darcy, whose pride, she was convinced, would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friends' connections than from their want of sense. And she was quite decided at last that it had been partly governed by the worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. The agitation and tears which her subject occasioned brought on a headache, and it grew so much worse towards the evening that, added to her unwillingness to see Mr. Darcy, it determined her not to attend her cousins to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. Mrs. Collins, seeing that she was really unwell, did not press her to go as much as possible, prevented her husband from pressing her. Mrs. Collins, seeing she was really unwell, did not press her to go as much as possible, prevented her husband from pressing her. But Mr. Collins would not conceal his apprehension of Lady Catherine's being rather displeased by her staying at home. So, that's Pride and Prejudice for this week. We will now move on to the riddles. If you do have any questions about the Pride and Prejudice or anything you want to discuss, leave them in chat and I will look at them shortly. With that said, the riddle that we finished off on last week, I think was 63. So the riddle is, no rose composed a lovelier hue. No rose can boast a lovelier hue than I can when my birth is new. Of shorter date than is that flower, I bloom and fade within an hour. Though some in me their honour place, I bear the token of disgrace. Like Marplot, eager to reveal the secrets I would fain conceal. Fools, coxcombs, wits agree in this, they equally destroy my peace. Though 'gainst my will to stoop so low, at their command I come and go. And the solution to that riddle is a blush. Particularly, I think the image is that of a blushing lady. So, 64. Born in a land of liberty, no creature ever was less free. For soon as born, I'm close confined, where none a door could ever find. But though twixt wooden walls thus pent, I quiet live and am content. For well I fare and pay no rent. 'Tis when my freedom I obtain, I'm first susceptible of pain. Sometimes man's sport, sometimes his guest, when known to him, are due to rest. Man who delights in fancies strange, and out of nature's bounds to range, deprives his horse and dogs of tail, and makes them loss of ears bewail. I'm often by his whims abused, for though walking never used, though hands or feet or legs I've none, yet for a sport I'm set to run. But when such freaks he takes, 'tis said, by some I've mounted to his head. Sometimes large sums of gold he gains, the fruit of my fatigue and pains, and when thus I have served his turn, me from his table oft he'll spurn. Though when thus cruel me he treats, he his desert in general meets. Goodness. This is a tough one. It's true what they say about depriving horses and dogs of their tails. That was a thing that was done. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure why, unless it was just an aesthetic thing, if they thought they looked better without them. But still. So, I will read it once more. Born in a land of liberty, no creature ever was less free. For soon as born, I am close confined, where none a door could ever find. But though twixt wooden walls thus pent, I quiet live and am content. For well I fare and pay no rent. 'Tis when my freedom I obtain, I'm first susceptible of pain. Sometimes man's sport, sometimes his guest, when known to him, are due to rest. Man who delights in fancies strange, and out of nature's bounds to range, deprives his horse and dogs of tail, and makes them loss of ear bewail. I'm assuming and makes them loss of ears bewail is referring to trimming the ears of dogs and apparently horses to change their appearance. But I could be wrong. That might be a far more modern practice. And I must admit, I hadn't heard of it being done on horses before. Only dogs. I'm often by his whims abused, for though to walking never used, though hands or feet or legs I've none, yet for his sport I'm set to run. But when such freaks he takes, 'tis said, by some I've mounted to his head. Sometimes large sums of gold he gains, the fruits of my fatigue and pains. And when thus I have served his turn, me from his table oft he'll spurn. Though when thus cruel me he treats, for his desert in general meets. I don't know. There's a few interesting hints here. Obviously being confined in wooden walls. The mention of pain is interesting. One has to wonder, is this actually something that can feel pain, in which case it's a living creature, probably an animal, or is this figurative, in which case it might denote something that does a lot of work, like, I don't know, the wheels of a cart or something, because, you know, they would be under such stress that over time they would break. They would deteriorate. Not having hands or feet or legs, but being able to run is also very interesting. Like, what things would you describe as running? Water? What else? Candle wax, maybe? Also, the sometimes large sums of gold he gains. The fruit of my fatigue and pains. That's also extremely interesting. Being spurned from the table? Again, very interesting. And does that mean from his table in the sense of on the table, or from his table in the sense of being invited to the table? On the table seems more likely to me, because the only thing you would usually invite to the table would be people, and this doesn't sound like a human being. And then, though when thus cruel me he treats, for his deserts in general meats, presumably means meeting one's just deserts, as in if he's cruel to me, usually he suffers as a result. So a lot of very interesting things being asserted, but I just cannot think what it could be. So I'm probably going to have to look it up. Regrettably. So I think that was 64. A maggot. Born in the land of liberty, no creature ever was less free. For as soon as I'm born, I'm close confined, where none a door could ever find. For though twixt wooden walls thus pen, I quiet live and am content. For well I fare and pay no rent. 'Tis when my freedom I obtain, I'm susceptible of pain. Sometimes man's sport, sometimes his guest, when known to him, are due to rest. Man who delights in fancies strange, and out of nature's bounds deranged, deprives his horse and dogs of tail, and makes them loss of ears bewail. I'm often by his whims abused, for though to walk never used, though hands or feet or legs I've none, yet for a sport I'm set to run. Are you? Was maggot racing a thing? When such freaks he takes, 'tis said, by some I've mounted to his head. I don't understand that. Sometimes large sums of gold he gains, the fruit of my fatigue and pains. Again, this sounds like some sort of gambling on maggot races, unless I'm completely misunderstanding this. I mean, I don't think it could even be an allusion to inheritance when somebody dies, simply because it says it's the fruit of the maggot's fatigue and pains. And when I have thus served his turn, me from his table oft he'll spurn, though when this cruel me he treats, he his desert in general meets. No, I don't get it. I don't understand that one. I feel like I'm missing some important context. Okay, 65. No mouth, no tongue, no nose, no ears I have. I neither walk nor stand, nor run nor fly. No sense I boast, nor of myself can harm the smallest fly, or breed the least alarm. Yet when into the hands of man I come, no furious fiend from Tartarus or Rome, that spreads her baleful poison as she flies, or with her breath contaminates the skies, can boast such mischief as takes birth from me, the noble and ignoble, bond and free. Alike my comforts or my terrors feel, more poignant far than swords of sharpest steel. 'Tis I instruct and prompt the wrangling bar, 'tis I forerun the miseries of war. Yet sainted martyrs owe alone to me the inspiring records of their constancy. Foes I make friends, and friends I oft make foes, yet I alike am true to these and those. Yet what's more strange, I, who can boast such power, am still dependent on the fleeting hour. My powers by age, but more by use, decline. My powers, if I ever might call them mine, for of myself I nothing can perform, no reason guides me, and no passions warm. 'Tis at the last, like merit scorned I lie, in some dark corner thrown neglected by. There lie and rot, as time and chance agree, to fix my lot, or date my destiny. No mouth, no tongue, no nose, no ears have I neither walk nor stand, nor run nor fly. No sense I boast, nor of myself can harm the smallest fly, or breed the least alarm. Yet when into the hands of man I come, no furious fiend from Tartarus or Rome, that spreads her baleful poison as she flies, and with her breath contaminates the skies, can boast such mischief as takes birth from me, the noble and ignoble, bond and free. Alike my comforts or my terrors feel, more poignant far than swords of sharpest steel. 'Tis I instruct and prompt the wrangling bar. I'm not sure what they mean by a wrangling bar. 'Tis I forerun the miseries of war. Yet sainted martyrs owe alone to me the inspiring records of their constancy. Foes I make friends, and friends I oft make foes, yet I alike am true to these and those. But what's more strange, I, who can boast such power, am still dependent on the fleeting hour. My powers by age, but more by use decline. My powers, if I ever might call them mine, for of myself I nothing can perform. For reason guides me, and no passions warm, till at the last, like merit scorned I lie, in some dark corner thrown neglected by. There lie and rot, as time and chance agree, to fix my lot, or date my destiny. The best I can think of is something like the written word, or possibly I think it must be something like the written word because of the last few lines. In some dark corner neglected by, there lie rot, as time and chance agree to fix my lot or date my destiny. Because that kind of makes sense, like what happens to all the documents we produce in the end? Well, I suppose, the answer would be different today. But, actually, would it? I was going to say it'd be different today, because, often old bits of paper get recycled, but I suppose it's not unreasonable to assume they would have thrown out documents they no longer needed, and they would have ended up on some sort of trash heap. Though that could be what they mean by in some dark corner thrown neglected by. Their lie and rot, as time and chance agree to fix my lot or date my destiny. So yeah, that's the best I can think of. Earlier on I was wondering if it could be something like gossip or something like that, but I don't think that's very likely anymore. So, that's my best guess. pen. That makes sense. I'm a little embarrassed I didn't think of that. Born in a land of liberty, no creature ever... sorry, that was the last one. No mouth, no tongue, no nose, no ears have I. I neither walk, nor stand, nor run, nor fly. No sense I boast, nor of myself can harm. The smallest fly, or breathe the least alarm. Yet, when into the hands of man I come, no furious stream from Tartarus or Rome, that spreads her baleful poison as she flies, and with her breath contaminates the skies, compose such mischief as takes birth from me, the noble and ignoble, bond and free, alike my comforts on my terrors feel, while poignant far than swords the sharpest steel, 'tis I instruct and prompt the wrangling bar. Still don't know what that is. Unless it's a reference to a court, maybe, as in pass the bar. Not sure. 'Tis I forerun the miseries of war, yet sainted martyrs owe alone to me 'tis inspiring records of their constancy. Foes I make friends, and friends I oft make foes, yet I alike am true to these and those. But what is more strange, I who can boast such power am still dependent on the fleeting hour. My powers by age, but more by use decline. My powers, if ever I might call them mine. For of myself I nothing can perform. No reason guides me, and no passions warm. Till at the last, till merit scorned I lie in some dark corner, friend neglected by. There lie and rot, as time and chance agree to fix my lot or date my destiny. A pen. I was close, but not quite there. Well, that'll have to do for this week, I think. So, thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be streaming again, hopefully on Friday and Saturday with more Pokemon Crystal. Then Wednesday, it'll be back to Grim Fandango. Grim Fandango Monday. Next Wednesday, we'll be back to Poetry, Prose, and Riddles. I think we'll raid Oh Hey Oh Hina. So, thank you for coming, everyone, and good night.